Miss Marple and the Mystery of Room Number 8. Chapter 1. Murder in Room 8. Miss Jane Marple had been looking forward to the trip for several weeks, ever since her nephew Raymond excitedly announced that a large book exhibition would be held in the neighboring city. Raymond, an avid collector with an unquenchable thirst for rare volumes, insisted that his aunt accompany him. Although Miss Marple's detective mind typically found fascination in human nature rather than printed pages, she adored Raymond and welcomed any chance to observe a wider slice of society. Thus, on a bright morning, they set off from St. Mary Mead in Raymond's modest sedan, discussing literary curiosities and the possibility of stumbling upon hidden gems at the exhibition. By midday they arrived at the bustling venue, a spacious hall filled with rows of tables stacked high with leather-bound tomes, first editions, signed copies, and more common paperbacks. The hum of friendly negotiation punctuated the air as collectors debated prices or traded their own books for new discoveries. Miss Marple wandered between the tables, occasionally pausing to chat with amiable booksellers. She gleaned small stories about their travels, how one had driven from distant Yorkshire in search of an elusive edition, while another carried a crate of detective novels once owned by her great-grandfather. For Raymond, the event was paradise. He spent much of the afternoon poring over antiquarian titles, chatting with fellow enthusiasts, and haggling over volumes that had once seemed out of reach. Miss Marple observed his delight with quiet satisfaction. She kept a watchful eye on everyone around her, noting mannerisms and overheard snippets of conversation. Even amid the pleasant swirl of collectors, she found hints of the drama that runs through everyday life. A bookseller who looked anxious to turn a quick profit, a young man shifting nervously as he clutched a rare find, a woman surreptitiously examining the contents of others' bags. It amused Miss Marple how, in any setting, people revealed more than they realized through gestures and tone. By the time Raymond concluded his final purchases, the sun had dipped below the skyline. He reluctantly tore himself from a vendor who specialized in obscure poetry and announced they should drive home. Miss Marple agreed, but when they stepped outside, evening light had faded to a purplish dusk. Navigating back to the main roads at that hour would be tedious and somewhat risky. They decided it would be far more sensible to find a nearby hotel and depart fresh in the morning. They secured a modest yet tidy establishment on a narrow street a short distance from the exhibition hall. The hotel had polished marble floors in the lobby and a single lift that clanked every time its doors slid shut. Miss Marple and Raymond booked adjoining rooms on the 4th floor. After a simple supper of soup and bread in the small dining area, they bade each other good night. Miss Marple retired early, satisfied by the day's events, with the promise of easy travel on the morrow. Sometime before dawn, Miss Marple awoke to raised voices echoing in the hallway. The usually still air of a hotel corridor now thrummed with commotion. She heard hurried footsteps, startled exclamations, and then an unmistakable cry. "There's been a murder!" Her heart quickened, and she immediately thought of Raymond, hoping he was safe. She donned her dressing gown and stepped outside, where she found him exiting his room in a similar state of alarm. Other guests peered through partially open doors, tension etched on their faces. A hotel maid, pale with shock, hurried by, muttering something about the 5th floor. In hushed tones, she recounted that a guest had been found shot in room 8. According to a flustered porter who trailed behind her, the occupant was discovered with a bullet wound, and a young woman stood beside him, gun in hand. Miss Marple pressed her fingertips to her mouth, absorbing the sudden turn of events. There was no chaos quite like the aftermath of violence in an otherwise mundane setting. The local police arrived soon after, led by a solidly built inspector with a brisk manner. Several uniformed constables followed, and Miss Marple noted their quick steps as they headed straight for the lift. Residents whispered in clusters along the lobby and stairs, desperate for details. Someone mentioned that the victim was a middle-aged man who had checked in late the previous evening, travelling under a common name that gave little clue to his identity. Others speculated about the young woman. Had she been a lover, a thief, or something else entirely? Miss Marple and Raymond stood near the reception desk, quietly observing. The manager, a neat and officious individual, explained to the inspector that the hotel's night porter heard a single gunshot and rushed upstairs only to find the door of room 8 partially open. Inside, a trembling woman clutched a revolver, staring at the wounded man on the floor. She made no attempt to flee. She simply stood there, apparently paralyzed. The porter froze in shock, then ran to telephone the police. The inspector asked for calm and requested that any guests with information remain available for questioning. Miss Marple, though rarely one to push herself forward, sensed that her presence might be of use here. Over the years, local constabularies had often welcomed her uncanny ability to notice small but telling details, and as fate would have it, this inspector seemed to recognize her name. Approaching Miss Marple with professional courtesy, he introduced himself as Inspector Garrett and acknowledged he had heard tales of her astute mind. He expressed gratitude if she might offer a helping hand. Surprised but pleased, Miss Marple nodded. Raymond hovered protectively by her side, still unsettled by this sinister development. Soon, the group stepped into the lift to head upstairs, though the device squeaked under the combined weight. On the 5th floor, the corridor was eerily quiet except for 2 constables guarding the doorway to room 8. A few guests lingered near the far end of the hallway, craning their necks for a glimpse of the scene. Miss Marple felt a faint chill. Hotels were typically places of transient comfort, a brief refuge away from home, but now the air tasted of dread. Inside the room, Inspector Garrett knelt near the fallen man. A dark stain spread across the carpet beneath his torso. The woman with the gun sat slumped against the wall, eyes wide, features strained with shock. One constable had carefully disarmed her. The revolver was placed on a nearby table next to a scattered collection of papers and an overturned lamp. The inspector stood and signaled a second constable to escort the woman away to a quieter space for questioning. Miss Marple and Raymond entered behind him. She scanned the narrow room, noting the unmade bed, the half-drawn curtains, and the man's open suitcase on the floor. Socks and neatly folded shirts spilled out as though disturbed in haste. A single window looked out onto the street, where distant lamplight illuminated parked cars. Nothing immediately suggested a forced entry. A detective in plain clothes began photographing the scene. Inspector Garrett turned to Miss Marple, quietly voicing his initial findings. The victim had registered under the name Mr. Duncan, but no one could confirm if it was genuine. There was no sign of a serious struggle. The young woman, apparently named Lucy, or Louise, the manager's memory faltered in the excitement, refused to speak beyond a broken claim of innocence. She had not fled, which was unusual for a cold-blooded killer, if that was indeed what she was. Miss Marple listened, eyes thoughtful. She asked whether the occupant had visitors earlier or if any staff recalled suspicious noises during the night. The manager, anxiously hovering in the hallway, claimed the hotel had been quiet before the shot. Miss Marple absorbed every word, her expression calm yet concentrated. She knew from past investigations that what looked straightforward often concealed deeper truths. Raymond, drawn to Miss Marple's side, studied the confusion around them. He admitted he felt out of his depth, but Miss Marple, in her usual understated manner, patted his arm and said, "Now, Raymond, we shall gather what we can and perhaps discover who Mr. Duncan really was, and why anyone would want him harmed. Inspector Garrett concurred, adding that if the young woman truly pulled the trigger, there had to be a motive. Yet the possibility of an accidental shooting or even a staged scenario lingered in his mind. Something about the scene, lack of apparent struggle, the woman's stunned composure, felt incongruous. He asked Miss Marple if she might question staff and guests for any scrap of information. She gladly obliged, recognizing that unguarded chatter could reveal vital clues. So began an unforeseen turn to Miss Marple's quiet trip. The hallway outside room 8 crackled with tension. While Raymond tried to offer comfort to shocked bystanders, Miss Marple prepared to unravel the tangled mystery. She sensed that beneath the surface of this tragic event lay hidden layers of motive and pretense. A single gun, a silent victim, and a shaken suspect. These three elements formed the heart of a puzzle only careful observation and patient inquiry could solve. Chapter 2. Shadows in Room 8. The moment Inspector Garrett pushed open the door of Room 8, a tense hush fell upon the small group behind him. Miss Marple stood just off his shoulder, observing every detail. Spread out on the rumpled bed was a middle-aged man, clearly lifeless, his eyes partially open in an uncanny stare. On the floor nearby lay a young woman, unconscious, her fingers still curled around a small, gleaming revolver. The scene was unnervingly still, save for the faint hum of the corridor's overhead lighting. Raymond, lingering behind his aunt, felt a cold shiver as he realized they had come face to face with a fresh tragedy. Inspector Garrett and a constable carefully knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse. Her breathing was shallow but present. Miss Marple, ever composed in the face of distress, murmured that they should ensure she received medical attention at once. As two uniformed officers helped the young woman onto the unsteady armchair in the corner, the inspector moved to examine the body on the bed. A single bullet wound stained the crisp sheets a dark, ominous red. While the scene looked straightforward, an apparent shooter and a victim, Miss Marple's experience told her that true explanations were rarely so simple. Soon after, the woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing confusion and alarm. Miss Marple gently introduced herself and inquired, "My dear, can you tell us what happened here?" The woman's lips parted, but no words emerged at first. Then, in a fractured voice, she insisted she had no idea. "I don't know how I got here," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't remember picking up a gun. I didn't kill anyone." It was a desperate, startled denial that made the inspector frown. He wasted no time pressing her further, reminding her that the revolver had been discovered in her hand. The woman shook her head adamantly, her face growing paler by the moment. Despite her evident shock, Miss Marple detected no obvious signs of deceit. The woman looked more terrified than cunning, as though she were grappling with a nightmare from which she hoped to awaken. The inspector found himself less inclined to sympathy. "You do realize how this appears?" he said, gesturing toward the bed. "A man is dead, and you're holding the weapon. If you want our help, you must be forthright about what led to this." The woman only pressed a trembling hand to her temple and repeated that she had no memory of the events. As the police continued their examination, Raymond drifted closer to his aunt, worried about the intensity of the situation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, kept her gaze fixed on the room's details, the slight disarray of the nightstand, the curtains drawn haphazardly, a damp patch on the carpet where water might have spilled. At her direction, a constable opened the closet, discovering a bag set off to one side. The bag was small, smartly designed, but locked tight. Inspector Garrett attempted to fiddle with the clasp, but it refused to budge. Even Miss Marple, with her deft, measured touch, had no success. Eager to discover what might be hidden within, the inspector instructed one of his subordinates to send the bag to a local locksmith. If it contained papers or objects that tied the victim and the woman together, those contents could prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. "We'll keep it in strict police custody," Inspector Garrett said firmly. "Once we have it opened, we'll know if there's anything that can confirm or deny this young woman's account." In the midst of this, the woman's eyes flickered toward the locked bag, but she offered no explanation. She appeared disoriented, plagued by intermittent dizziness. Miss Marple quietly requested that a doctor be summoned to evaluate her. Though some might judge the woman harshly for being found in such a compromising position, Miss Marple trusted her instinct. There was a veil of genuine confusion clinging to her like a frightened child lost in a storm. Before long, a constable guided the woman gently from the room, while others prepared to move the body for further examination. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, staring at the abandoned gun, the half-open window letting in a faint breeze from the street below. A creeping conviction told her that the truth behind this incident would not be easily uncovered. Too many pieces were missing, and while the bag might hold critical answers, Miss Marple suspected deeper secrets lurked beneath the surface. Quietly, she followed the inspector out into the corridor. Already she could sense the threads of suspicion coiling around the young woman's fragile state. Miss Marple resolved to keep a clear mind and a careful eye on every detail, no matter how mundane. Something about this murder felt altogether stranger than it appeared, and she would use every scrap of her meticulous observation to find the real story behind the body in Room 8, Chapter 3. A Somber Revelation. Miss Marple and Inspector Garrett left the hotel with quiet purpose, the managers hastily scrawled address in hand. A light drizzle accompanied their steps, lending a somber note to the city's narrow streets. Though morning had broken, clouds hung low, as if nature itself understood the severity of recent events. Raymond had stayed behind at the hotel, keen to glean more observations from the staff and guests who lingered in the lobby. The address led them to a tall, ivy-covered home in a respectable part of town. A modest brass plate next to the door read John Farnsworth, revealing the owner's name. Responding to Inspector Garrett's firm knock, a tired-looking housekeeper answered and showed them into a small but comfortable sitting room. There, a man with greying hair rose from an armchair and offered polite but strained greetings. "I'm John Farnsworth," he said. "I own the Willow Crest Hotel. You must be Inspector Garrett, and this must be Miss Marple." "That's correct," the inspector replied, removing his hat. "We appreciate you agreeing to see us on such short notice." Miss Marple observed Farnsworth closely as he gestured for them to sit. The worry etched into his features suggested genuine concern. She began by recounting the unsettling discovery in Room 8. A man fatally shot, a young woman found unconscious and clutching a revolver. Farnsworth's expression tightened, and he let out a measured sigh. "Your manager mentioned you might be personally acquainted with the deceased," Miss Marple said, choosing her words gently. "We thought it best to hear your recollections, especially if they might shed light on who he was and why he visited." Farnsworth rested his elbows on his knees. "Yes," he began, voice subdued. "I knew him. His name was Andrew Lonsdale, though he checked in under an assumed name, didn't he?" "I'm not surprised. Andrew sometimes preferred anonymity when traveling. He was a private man." Inspector Garrett leaned forward. "So you can confirm that the dead man is indeed Andrew Lonsdale?" "Yes," Farnsworth replied. "Andrew and I have been friends for years. He'd written a few days ago, saying he was coming to the city for some urgent business. I invited him to stay here at my home, but he refused. He said something about wanting his own space, not wishing to burden me. I insisted, but Andrew could be stubborn." Miss Marple nodded, sympathy in her gaze. "And so you directed him to your hotel instead?" "That's correct. It's the least I could do, make sure he was housed in a decent place. I never would have imagined—" Farnsworth's voice trailed off, pained realization flickering across his eyes. "This is dreadful. A murder in my own establishment and a close friend lost." For a moment, the room fell silent, broken only by the subdued ticking of a grandfather clock. Miss Marple's careful intuition told her Farnsworth spoke the truth. His regret and grief appeared genuine. Yet she also knew that sincerity did not preclude hidden truths or complicating factors. Inspector Garrett cleared his throat. "Mr. Farnsworth, do you have any idea why Lonsdale might have been targeted? Any enemies he might have made?" Farnsworth shook his head. "Not that I'm aware of. Andrew kept his affairs private, but I never knew him to get into serious trouble. Though in the past year he seemed more guarded, made cryptic remarks about certain business dealings." Miss Marple absorbed every word, recalling the locked bag retrieved from room 8. Perhaps it contained documents relating to Lonsdale's secretive affairs. She also remembered the young woman claiming total ignorance of the crime. If Lonsdale had been navigating dangerous territory, could she have been caught in the crossfire? Or was there another motive entirely? "Did Lonsdale mention meeting anyone specific in this city?" asked Inspector Garrett. Farnsworth paused, brow creased in thought. "He never gave details. He only mentioned something about a potential partnership. An investment, perhaps. I wondered if it was wise, given how evasive he was." Miss Marple offered a kindly look. "Do you recall anything else, no matter how small?" He exhaled slowly. "Only that he seemed uncharacteristically tense. He even joked that I might hear surprising news soon." Farnsworth ran a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry I can't tell you more. If I'd realized he was in any real danger, I would have insisted he stay under my roof." Miss Marple and Inspector Garrett exchanged a glance, each sensing that Farnsworth's sorrow was genuine, yet incomplete. Perhaps the next clue would lie in the locked bag, or with the mysterious young woman who had awakened to a nightmare. Chapter 4. The Mysterious Eighth Room. Inside John Farnsworth's tastefully furnished study, Miss Marple and Inspector Garrett concluded their explanation of the events at the Willow Crest Hotel. Framed paintings and a row of hardcover books lent the space a serene air, but tension underlay every word. Their host, both the hotel's owner and a friend to the victim, had just finished describing his shock over Andrew Lonsdale's death. Before Miss Marple and the inspector took their leave, she produced a small photograph of the young woman discovered with the gun. Her expression was neutral, yet inquisitive, as she handed it across the large, mahogany desk. "Do you recognize her?" Miss Marple asked softly. "She was found unconscious in the room." Farnsworth leaned forward, furrowing his brow at the image. He turned it this way and that, as if trying to recall a half-forgotten face, but he soon shook his head. "Who is this girl? I don't know her," he said, returning the picture. "I wish I could help more. This terrible news has already disturbed me greatly." Inspector Garrett, watching carefully, noted that Farnsworth's voice did not waver, nor did he offer any speculation. He simply reiterated his ignorance of the young woman's identity. Satisfied that no further insight would be gained at the moment, the inspector thanked Farnsworth for his time. Miss Marple did the same, though she lingered a moment, studying the hotel owner's troubled features. His genuine grief at his friend's fate was unmistakable, yet she could not entirely dismiss the notion that there might be details he chose to withhold. With a final exchange of civilities, Miss Marple and the inspector departed the residence. A steady drizzle greeted them outside, mirroring the subdued atmosphere of their thoughts as they climbed into a waiting taxi. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, punctuated only by Inspector Garrett voicing his unresolved questions. Why had Lonsdale refused to stay with Farnsworth instead, opting for a room that was hardly a secret refuge? And how had the unknown girl become entangled in what now seemed far from a straightforward murder? Arriving at the Willow Crest, they stepped from the taxi and made their way through the lobby's glass doors. Miss Marple's gaze flicked discreetly over the staff. As she recalled Farnsworth's repeated claims of ignorance about the girl, she resolved to remain watchful. In her experience, appearances could be misleading, and even genuine grief did not preclude deeper mysteries. Stripping off their damp coats, they headed directly for the lift, keen to revisit the site of the crime. Miss Marple felt an unshakable conviction that some overlooked detail in room 8 might illuminate the tragedy. As they waited for the elevator, a thought struck her. The hotel manager had mentioned each floor contained 7 rooms. She mentally tallied the ones she had passed on the lower floors, rooms 1 through 7, on each level. Yet the murder occurred in a so-called room 8. Why would that be? The moment the doors slid open onto the 5th floor, Miss Marple paused to absorb the corridor's layout. The furnishings were identical to those on the lower levels, carpeted floors, brass sconces at regular intervals, but here stood a door marked with a neat black 8. The corridor ended there, leaving nowhere else to go except the stairwell. If the hotel adhered to its usual pattern, there should be no 8th door. She cast a thoughtful look at Inspector Garrett. We must confirm whether this numbering is deliberate or simply an oversight. Her mind whirled with possibilities. Perhaps the space had been converted, or a hidden arrangement existed for guests wishing secrecy. If Farnsworth knew about this anomaly, he might have directed his friend to that particular room for a reason. Inspector Garrett nodded his agreement, making a quick note in a small pad. Let's examine the building records and speak with the manager again, he said. If the hotel was built to have only 7 rooms per floor, we need to find out exactly how this 8th one came to be. With that, they passed the taped-off threshold to where the murder had taken place. Though the evidence of death cast a somber pall, Miss Marple pressed on, determined to glean any final clue concealed in the silent halls. The odd numbering loomed large in her mind, a signpost pointing to deeper secrets. She resolved to follow it, convinced that discovering the truth behind the 8th room might unlock the entire mystery. Chapter 5. The Hidden Chamber. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Miss Marple returned to room 8. The police tape still clung to the doorframe, fluttering slightly in the draught that followed her inside. She stepped quietly into the dim room, her eyes scanning every object with renewed focus. A constable stood just outside in the hallway, stationed there under Inspector Garrett's orders, but inside Miss Marple was alone with her thoughts and the lingering echoes of something far more sinister than a simple murder. The air was musty, faintly metallic, and different from the other rooms she had visited during her stay. There was something about the proportions, the layout, even the light. It all felt wrong. The room, she thought, had the character of a disguise. She began with the walls. Walking slowly, Miss Marple traced her fingers along the wallpaper seams. She paused now and then to bend closer to the edges of the moulding or press lightly against the surface. Then she knocked, softly at first, then more firmly, listening for variations in the sound. The left wall gave a solid, reassuring thud. The right wall echoed slightly as if backed by a hollow space. She furrowed her brow and moved toward the far corner, near the wardrobe. That's when she heard it. A faint, unnatural creak, barely noticeable, came from behind the wardrobe as her knuckles rapped against the paneling beside it. Miss Marple stilled, then pressed her ear closer to the wall. There it was again, not the solid resonance of plaster and brick, but a softer, more resonant tone, as if the wall were merely a partition. She straightened at once and called for the constable. "Would you be so kind," she said politely, "as to assist me in moving this wardrobe? I believe there may be something behind it worth examining." The constable looked uncertain but nodded. Together they gripped the heavy wooden frame and gently edged it away from the wall. The wardrobe groaned on the old carpet, resisting at first, but then gave way. As it shifted, the outline of a door, hidden behind the panelling, was revealed. A narrow seam and a faint brass latch were just barely visible in the wall's design. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed with quiet triumph. "This," she murmured, "is no ordinary room." With the constable's help, the door was carefully opened. Dust puffed out into the air, and the narrow passage led into a hidden chamber, scarcely more than 8 feet wide and entirely unmarked. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a yellowish glow over the strange machinery inside. At the center of the space stood a counterfeit money-printing machine, industrial, compact, and chillingly out of place. Metal plates, sheets of unfinished currency, and ink rollers sat nearby, as if someone had used the machine recently and left in haste. The smell of ink still lingered in the air. The constable stared, mouth slightly agape. Counterfeit printing. Here? In a hotel? Miss Marple stepped inside carefully, her shoes silent against the floor. She inspected the machine, the plates, and the false bills, strewn across a nearby table. It all pointed to a secret operation, well organized, concealed from public view, and likely the true reason Room 8 existed at all. "This explains everything," Miss Marple said softly. "Why the victim insisted on staying here, why he refused to stay at Mr. Farnsworth's house, and why Room 8 doesn't fit the hotel's layout. The murder, she realized, might not have been about jealousy or impulse. It could have been the result of something far more deliberate. Perhaps Andrew Lonsdale had discovered the secret and paid the price, or worse, perhaps he had been involved himself. As the constable stepped out to summon Inspector Garrett, Miss Marple remained by the machine, eyes fixed on the intricate network of deception unraveling before her. A murder, a mysterious girl, and now a secret printing operation. Room 8 had given up one of its secrets, but many questions still remained, and Miss Marple intended to answer them all. Chapter 6. The Face Behind the Mask. The next morning, as a pale sun crept through the clouded sky, the locksmith's delivery arrived at the Willow Crest Hotel. A plain, unmarked parcel was brought to the lobby and handed over to Inspector Garrett with quiet urgency. Inside was the locked bag, the same one recovered from Room 8, near the unconscious girl, and the dead man. Now it had been forced open under police supervision. Miss Marple and the inspector gathered in a private sitting area off the main hallway, the bag resting on a coffee table between them. A constable stood watch at the door. With a steady hand, Inspector Garrett unfastened the buckles and lifted the lid. A stunned silence followed. Neatly stacked bundles of cash lay inside, rows upon rows of notes, bound tightly with string. At first glance, it looked like a fortune. Garrett gave a low whistle and reached for a bundle, flipping through the crisp currency. But even before he could speak, Miss Marple had stepped closer, her sharp eyes scanning the paper. "This money," she said softly, "isn't real." The inspector paused. "You're certain?" She nodded. "Quite. The ink is too fresh, the paper is slightly off, and the watermark is either absent or printed crudely. These are counterfeits, very good ones, but fake nonetheless." Garrett handed the notes to a constable for verification, who confirmed her assessment within moments. "All of it's forged, sir," he said grimly. Miss Marple folded her hands. That printing machine in the hidden room makes much more sense now. It was clear. Room 8 wasn't simply a guest room. It had been used to operate a covert counterfeiting ring. The man who had died, Andrew Lonsdale, was somehow involved. The girl's presence had remained unexplained, until now. Inspector Garrett stood. "Bring in the girl," he ordered the constable, "and send for the hotel owner. I think it's time we hear the truth." Within 20 minutes, both the girl and John Farnsworth arrived, separately. The girl was pale but composed, seated on a small armchair near the fireplace. Farnsworth entered briskly, his expression guarded but calm. Then something unexpected happened. As soon as the girl saw Farnsworth, her eyes widened. She rose shakily to her feet, and in a trembling voice cried, "Uncle!" The room fell silent. Miss Marple's head turned sharply toward Farnsworth. His face had frozen, the color draining from his cheeks. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "You told us you didn't know her, Mr. Farnsworth," she said, her voice quiet but piercing. "And yet she just called you uncle. Care to explain?" Farnsworth hesitated, just a second, but the crack in his composure was enough. He looked at the girl, then at Miss Marple, and finally at Inspector Garrett, who had folded his arms and waited patiently. With a defeated sigh, Farnsworth sat down heavily. "I suppose there's no use denying it now," he said, his voice hoarse. "Yes, she's my niece, Clara. And I lied. I said I didn't know her because I thought I could still cover it up." Inspector Garrett's tone was cold. "Cover what up, exactly?" Farnsworth looked down at his hands. "The entire operation, the counterfeit scheme. It was mine. At least, I was the one who funded it. Andrew was the technician. He used to work in printing before his career went downhill. Clara, she was never supposed to be involved, but she found out." Chapter 7. Secrets Behind the Wall. The air in the hotel's private lounge was heavy, thick with the weight of truth finally uncovered. John Farnsworth sat slumped in the leather armchair, his face pale, his posture broken. The commanding confidence he once carried as the proud owner of the Willowcrest Hotel had crumbled into a hollow shell of guilt and regret. In front of him stood Inspector Garrett, arms crossed, jaw clenched, and beside him Miss Marple, composed and ever watchful. "I was the one who had Andrew killed," Farnsworth said suddenly, his voice flat and lifeless. The silence in the room was immediate and profound. "He was my friend, at least he used to be." Inspector Garrett leaned forward. "Go on." Farnsworth exhaled slowly, then continued, his words tumbling out like stones. "When he came to the hotel a few nights ago, I offered to let him stay at my home, but he refused. He said he needed privacy to finish up some work. What I didn't know, what I never imagined, was that the hotel was fully booked that evening. No standard rooms were left." He paused, rubbing his temples, then looked up, bitterly. "The staff, without knowing any better, gave him that room, the one I'd kept hidden. Room 8, my special room, the room behind the wall." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she watched him intently. "He found it," Farnsworth continued. "He found the hidden door, the printing machine, everything. That idiot even opened the bag filled with the counterfeit notes, and must have realized what I'd been doing for years. He confronted me the next morning, threatened to go to the authorities. Said I had 24 hours to shut everything down and confess, or he would." Inspector Garrett narrowed his eyes. "So you decided to silence him?" Farnsworth nodded slowly. "I panicked. I'd built everything, my hotel, my name, my reputation, on a lie. The money funded it all. If he exposed me, I'd lose everything." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't know what else to do, but I knew one thing. Andrew couldn't leave that room alive." Garrett's voice turned sharp. "And your niece, Clara?" Miss Marple gently stepped forward. "You used her, didn't you?" Farnsworth looked down at his hands, ashamed. "Clara had no idea what I was involved in, but I'd studied hypnosis in my younger days. It was something of a hobby, nothing serious. But I still remembered how to use it. Suggestion, repetition, planting thoughts deep enough that they'd seem like her own ideas. He paused. So I put her under. Told her she would wake up in that room. That she would walk in at the right time, be found there, holding the gun. That she wouldn't remember a thing. Inspector Garrett took a slow step forward. And you arranged for the actual killing? Yes, I had someone waiting, Farnsworth said, his voice barely audible. Clara entered first. She was confused, disoriented. Andrew must have tried to calm her down, and then the shot. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. And the bag? I never meant for it to be found, Farnsworth replied bitterly. Andrew must have moved it out of the hidden room before the murder, probably as evidence. Had he not done that, you would have searched the room, found nothing, and assumed it was a simple case of personal dispute gone wrong. He looked up at them both now, his eyes hollow. But everything went wrong. The staff gave him the wrong room. Clara walked into the trap meant to protect me, and the bag sealed my fate. Miss Marple remained quiet for a moment, then spoke. You tried to control every variable, Mr. Farnsworth, but human nature has a habit of defying expectations. That's what makes murder such a foolish plan. Inspector Garrett stepped aside and signaled the constables waiting at the door. John Farnsworth, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, the murder of Andrew Lonsdale, fraud, illegal printing of counterfeit currency, and obstruction of justice. Farnsworth didn't resist as the constables cuffed him. He simply rose and allowed himself to be led away, a man who had gambled everything and lost. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Clara, who sat quietly at the far end of the room, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. He used me, she whispered. He used me like I was nothing. Miss Marple walked over and took her hand. You were a pawn, my dear, but you're not to blame for what he did. Now the truth has come out, and justice will follow. Outside the window the rain had stopped, and sunlight began to break through the clouds. The long shadow of Room 8 had finally lifted, but the memory of the secrets it held would linger for a long time to come. Chapter 8. The picture on the mantel. The hotel lounge had fallen into a hush. Outside the clouds had begun to part, casting soft beams of late afternoon light across the carpeted floor. John Farnsworth, now handcuffed and flanked by constables, stood silently near the window. His once carefully guarded facade had crumbled. The web of lies, deception, and murder he had so delicately spun had finally unraveled. Miss Marple, ever composed, stepped forward. Her eyes met Farnsworth's, calm yet resolute. I suspected you, she said softly, from the very first time I visited your home. Farnsworth turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. It was something quite small, she continued. But as is often the case, small things reveal great truths. While Inspector Garrett asked his questions, I took a moment to look around your sitting room. There, above the fireplace, was a family photograph, framed and proudly displayed. You stood in the center, smiling as if everything in the world belonged to you. She paused, letting the memories settle in her mind. And beside you was a girl. A young woman with kind eyes and auburn hair. The very same girl who would later be found unconscious in Room 8. Clara, seated quietly on the sofa, looked up with wide eyes. Farnsworth's lips tightened. I recognized her instantly, Miss Marple said. It wasn't a coincidence, and yet, when we asked you about her, you claimed you had never seen her before. That, Mr. Farnsworth, was your mistake. Farnsworth's shoulders sagged. For a moment he didn't speak, but then, with a weary sigh, he gave a bitter smile. Yes, he admitted, his voice low. I did all of it, for the property. Inspector Garrett narrowed his eyes. Property? Farnsworth nodded. Clara's parents, my brother and sister-in-law, left her a sizable estate before they passed. She was still a child at the time, so the inheritance remained untouched, tied up in her name, until she reached 25. I was the legal guardian for a while, but when she came of age, control transferred fully to her. She never even understood the value of what she owned, just some quiet land outside the city, some shares in a family trust, a country house no one had lived in for years. But I knew, and I wanted it. He looked at Clara, guilt flickering in his eyes. You were never supposed to be involved like this, not truly. Clara turned away, her voice shaking. But you did involve me. You hypnotized me, used me. I trusted you. Farnsworth faced Inspector Garrett again. I knew Andrew, my friend, was desperate. He'd fallen into debt, had no one else. I lured him in with the promise of a business partnership, brought him into the operation, showed him the counterfeiting setup in room 8. I thought I could control him, that he'd stay loyal for the promise of money. Miss Marple folded her arms. But you miscalculated. He saw an opportunity. He started blackmailing me, Farnsworth admitted. Said he'd go to the police unless I handed over a significant portion of the earnings. I couldn't afford that, not just financially, but reputationally. So I began planning a way to eliminate him and shift the blame elsewhere. He looked back toward Clara. I knew if she were found at the scene, confused and disoriented, the police would assume a tragic act of passion. She was close to Andrew once. He'd mentored her briefly. It would make just enough sense. And with the right timing, the murder would look like her doing. She wouldn't remember anything. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her words were sharp. You believed you could have everything, the money, the property, freedom from your blackmailer, and leave no trace pointing back to you. Farnsworth nodded slowly. Exactly. Everything was going according to plan until the staff mistakenly placed Andrew in the hidden room. That room was never meant for guests, but the hotel was fully booked. And when he opened the bag full of fake currency, I knew it was over. All it took was one mistake, and Clara seeing me again was the final crack in the mirror. Inspector Garrett stepped forward, voice firm. You'll be formally charged with the murder of Andrew Lonsdale, conspiracy, fraud, and the illegal use of hypnosis to manipulate your niece. The courts will decide the rest. The constables began escorting Farnsworth out of the room. He offered no resistance, only a final glance at Clara. I never wanted to hurt you, he murmured, before being led away. The door shut behind him with a final click. Clara sat in silence, her hands trembling. Miss Marple moved to her side and gently took her hand. You were caught in someone else's scheme, she said kindly. But you're free of it now. And with the truth known, you can begin again. Clara looked at her with tear-filled eyes. Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know how to begin making sense of any of it. Start with honesty, Miss Marple said, and everything else will follow. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the room in golden light, the shadows of deceit that had long lingered over room 8 began to fade. Justice had spoken, and once again the quiet wisdom of Miss Marple had brought the truth to light. Epilogue. A quiet return. Several days had passed since the truth behind the murder at the Willowcrest Hotel had been revealed. The police investigation had concluded, and the media had lost interest after a flurry of headlines. Hotel owner behind shocking murder. Counterfeit ring exposed in luxury hotel, and woman framed by her own uncle. The story had stunned the city, but for Miss Marple, the end of a case never brought celebration, only quiet reflection. She and Raymond returned to St. Mary Mead as the countryside slipped back into its usual peaceful rhythm. The garden outside her cottage had begun to bloom again, untouched by scandal or crime. Miss Marple resumed her daily rituals, a slow walk through the village, tea with the vicar's wife, and a bit of knitting in the late afternoon sun. Raymond, though still shaken by what they had witnessed, had found new respect for his aunt's sharp mind. "You see things the rest of us overlook," he'd said, during their journey home. "It's almost frightening how calm you are, even with a body lying in front of you." Miss Marple had only smiled and replied, "It's not calm, dear, it's patience. People tell you everything even when they don't use words. You just have to be listening." Back in the city, Clara had been placed in the care of a reputable doctor and given counselling. Inspector Garrett, deeply moved by her ordeal, made sure she was protected and her name cleared publicly. Her inheritance, once a motive for greed and betrayal, was now hers to control freely. She wrote to Miss Marple a week later a short but heartfelt letter of gratitude. "You saw through it all when no one else could. I owe you my freedom and perhaps my life." "Thank you." As for John Farnsworth, he was now awaiting trial. No longer a man of influence or stature, he faced the consequences of his ambition and deceit. The hidden room in the hotel had been sealed off permanently, the counterfeit machine dismantled by authorities. Room 8 was never used again. Eventually the hotel changed ownership, and its new management quietly renumbered the rooms. There was no longer a Room 8 on the 5th floor. Miss Marple never sought fame for her part in solving the case. Her satisfaction came not from recognition, but from knowing that justice had prevailed, and that a vulnerable girl had been spared a terrible fate. One morning, as she trimmed her roses and gently swept fallen petals from the path, the postman passed by and tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Marple. No murders this week, I hope?" She chuckled softly. "Not yet, Mr. Jenkins, but the week's still young." And with that, she returned to her tea, her garden, and the quiet certainty that, should evil ever come again, no matter how well it disguised itself, she would be ready to face it with a steady eye and an unshakable sense of truth.